Okay, if everyone could just help themselves to lunch. And so I'm Sanjay Bhattacharya. I work for the Center for Global Health Histories at the University of York, which is part of its history department. And the center is also a WHO collaborating center for global health histories. And I'm honored and I'm pleased to be here to introduce Global Health Histories Seminar 101. And it's very special for me because it's the 100th seminar I've been involved with. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here. This relates to the cultural context of health, information for health, and will address the interconnections between health information and data. Recent research dealing with the cultural and historical context of data has suggested that data is not simply information that is harvested from objective contexts. The process of producing data is a complex one, making data contingent on numerous factors. Data should therefore be understood not as value-free, existing independently of human beings, but as institutionally, socially, and culturally informed products. Today, the speakers will explore this perspective on data from important and different points of view. The seminar is being live streamed on the internet, and online audiences are invited to ask questions via Slido or Twitter, and my colleague Niels Fittier will describe that in greater detail a little while later. A few words about the Global Health History Seminar series, considering it's the 101st. The series has been running since 2004. It has been generously funded by the Wellcome Trust, both indirectly and directly since then. The Trust is a global charitable organization based in the UK. The series is organized together with the University of York's WHO Collaborating Center, and it was originally based out of the WHO headquarters. The series has recently moved to WHO Europe. In 2015 and 16, WHO Europe has hosted seminars on Ebola, migration, food, and environment. And if I remember right, the first one was on antimicrobial resistance. And Niels attended that as a representative of the Trust, which is... we plan to hold 2 or 3 seminars a year, and the next seminar is scheduled for the 21st of September 2017. And it'll be on e-health. Over the same period, we have also worked from Europe with other regional offices, WHO Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office, the Pan-American Health Organization, as well as WHO country offices in Sri Lanka, Brazil, and India. The aim of the series is to explore not only key public health issues, but also their historical, social, and cultural context. To this end, the series brings together researchers from the humanities and social sciences with senior officials from the WHO, other UN agencies, and major charitable foundations to contribute their perspectives and ideas. The Cultural Context of Health project is based, as you know, in this regional office, and it is the focal point for the Global Health History Seminars. The CCH project seeks to enhance public health policymaking through a nuanced understanding of how cultural contexts affect health and healthcare. It does so by advocating the importance of considering culture in health. It moreover works towards a better integration of research from health-related humanities and social sciences into the work of the WHO. CCH is mainly dedicated to 4 focus areas that are also current central concerns in public health: nutrition, well-being and mental health, migration, and environment, all very important topics. Now to our speakers. Dr. Jeremy Farrar is the director of the UK-based Wellcome Trust, one of the world's largest charitable foundations dedicated to improving health. He is one of the world's leading figures in the field of infectious diseases, tropical health, and emerging infections. He has chaired a number of advisory boards for governments and global organizations, including the WHO. Before joining Wellcome in October 2013, Jeremy ran the Oxford University Clinical Research Unit in Vietnam for 18 years. It has given him a unique perspective on tackling pandemics and the importance of sharing information between governments and health bodies. I'm sure all of you know Claudia, but Dr. Claudia Stein, for our online audiences, is the Director of the Division of Information, Evidence and Research and Innovation at the WTO Regional Office for Europe. Her division is responsible for gathering and analyzing health data, evidence and research, and turning them into policy tools for member states, including quantitative and increasingly qualitative information. With degrees in medicine and public health and a PhD in epidemiology, she joined the WHO in 1998. Today, she'll be drawing on her many years of experience working within the areas of health information, statistics, and burden of disease. And what this briefing note for me does not mention is that Claudia spent many years in India and can actually speak some Indian languages as well, which is hugely impressive. Professor Morten Jerven. Jerven?
Both works.
Okay. Which one do you prefer?
Jerven.
Jerven? Okay. Professor Morten Jerven is a professor of development studies, international environment, and development studies at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and adjunct professor in economic history at Lund University. He is an economic historian, particularly interested in African economic history. In his influential book from 2013, Poor Numbers: How We Are Misled by African Development Statistics and What to Do About It, Professor Jerven explores how inadequate statistical data from sub-Saharan Africa have misled development researchers, donors, policymakers, and economists in estimates of economic growth rates. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Niels Fittier, who will take it from here. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, I'm probably the least interesting person on this panel, so I'm going to be as quiet as possible. But I'm going to give a quick introduction to a tool that we like to use during these seminars that allows you to interact with the speakers, both for our online audiences, but also in the room, if you prefer to use online means rather than raising your hand. So if those of you who are interested and have mobile phones, I'm assuming that's pretty much all of you. If you want, just take out your mobile phone and type in the URL slido.com. And on the site that comes up, you'll have a box, and if you type in GHH, Global Health Histories, GHH, you'll get to the relevant page. Now, I'll get to you in a second, so if you get out your phones and you put that in, I'll explain to you what to do. But in the meantime, I'm going to talk to our online audiences, because this is being live web streamed globally, to let them know that you should be on that web page that you can see here. There's a box below the live video feed, so you might have to scroll down in your browser. And on that box, you can see a window where you can type in your questions. We encourage you to type in questions. We encourage you to use your name when you do so, but you can also leave questions anonymously. The questions will be vetted in the back, so we have somebody who, my colleague Sine, who will be helping us kind of create them live. And once they are live, they'll appear on that screen to the right. And you're more than welcome to add questions as they come up. You don't have to wait till the end. So back to our in-the-room audiences. If you're using your mobile phone, you should see something similar to that. Once again, you can submit your questions in that interface and press send and send it anonymously or add your name. A couple of things about Slido in general. It allows you to submit questions anonymously, as I mentioned, but we prefer you to use your name. Feel free to submit the questions while the session is running, so you don't have to wait until the end. And crucially, you can vote on existing questions if you think they're really good. So that's kind of why we've introduced this mechanism to begin with, because it democratizes the aspect of asking questions in the room. So hopefully we'll have some really interesting questions. Hopefully you will vote them up, and at the end we should have a list of 3 or 4 or so questions that are the most eagerly, for whom you await the answer the most eagerly. So there are the channels that you can use. You can tweet to GH Histories, or you can send an email to eughh@who.int. But we encourage you to use the Slido interface if you can. So, as promised, I try to keep it short, and that's all from me. And I'm going to hand over to Jeremy to kick us off. Thank you very much. Good. Oh, you don't need the clicker.
So thanks very much for that, for the introduction and for the invitation. And Sanjay, can I just, on behalf of everybody, thank you for your energy over the last, 100 of these. He told us last night that he's also been able to have 98 dinners as a result of this. And I didn't like to remind him, but actually by chance I happen to be reading at the moment, which I think is very topical. And if you haven't read it since you were a teenager at school, please go back and read it, 1984. And if anybody remembers what Room 101 was, and the dystopian future that 1984 represents, I think it's worth going back to read that. But with all of that social media that we've got coming online for us, it does feel a little bit like one's greatest fear to be standing here with no PowerPoint slides or anything else and giving a 10 or 12 minute introduction. Anyway, so I'm only really going to say three things if you take away anything from the next 10 or so 12 minutes, which is that I think we've got to make the case for information flows and data ever more stronger, and we should never take for granted that is just a given, and that information and data flow, and I'll use those two words interchangeably, I appreciate their differences, is absolutely has to be built on a sense of trust. And I think the building of trust in how we as organizations all work is absolutely critical over the coming years. And I think of political events of the last year or two have demonstrated that when one loses that sense of trust and connection, then one loses many things that make our values so important to us. And that trust can only be gained, and it can be lost in an instant, and it can only be sustained if we all ensure that we bring the greatest value of sharing that information and data to the greatest number of people. And I think organizations such as this, and it's great that WHO Euro has taken over the hosting of this series, has to be in connection with societies, and we have to stand up for the world counts in all of the meanings of that the whole world counts, not just numbers, but that the whole world counts. And the fight against inequalities, I think, has to be central to everything we do. So making that case for data benefit and information benefit, I think, is really very important. And every organization, no modern organization can work without access and use of data. But I do believe that the public sector and the public-private sector is getting blurred. But I do think the public sector is losing ground in this space to the private sector. And I think we've got to re-look at how those two sectors interact. And for WHO, I think that means learning again to work. The challenge of WHO and working how to work with the commercial sector is always a challenge. It's traditionally seen that through the lens of pharmaceutical industries and others. I think we need to recalibrate and think how we're going to, in the future, work with other organisations in that commercial sector who I think do have things to offer, but who are running faster, I believe, than the public sector is. Of course, the benefits of data sharing are huge. We all know that. But just to remind people, in my own background of emerging infections, the Ebola outbreak demonstrated the importance of sharing information timely and responding to it. In fact, I started out in emerging infections during SARS in 2003, 2004. And the sharing of information at that stage was very different to what it is today. But we should not think that we've got to where we want to get to in terms of epidemics. And the current outbreak of H7N9, the ongoing Zika problems remind us just how critical the sharing of information is. But we will not get sharing of information if we don't build those critical components of trust and we don't share the benefits of sharing that information. And I don't think as a world we've yet squared that circle. But it's not just in emerging infections or infections generally that this is true. If almost anything in relation to health, whether it be the rare diseases or the coming of climate change, the impact of climate change on health, the drug-resistant infections, all of these ultimately have two features. One is they need information. They need that information to be shared. And the truth is there is no national response that will work to any of those. And the ability to share across borders is absolutely crucial. And again, if we don't rebuild in that sharing of benefits of sharing that information, we won't all benefit from it at a global level, which again reduces inequalities. It also, of course, allows better decisions to be making, and in a resource-limited world, allow better resource allocation. And everybody is now doing it. I flew in from London yesterday. There will be I don't know how many organisations which will know where I had dinner last night, will know where I slept last night, will know the first person I phoned this morning, or the information we're sharing is on an unprecedented scale. And yet we are trusting elements of that, and we're not trusting other elements. And there are huge generational differences. Even my generation, which is not that different to some of the people in the generation in this room, are not quite as comfortable in the sharing of information as younger generations. And the way that younger generations see the sharing of information and older generations, which I feel I'm part of, is different. And I don't think we yet, as a world, understand that intergenerational difference. And ultimately, this all comes back to a social contract. If you look around just this region, if you look around Europe and you look at the social contracts in the United Kingdom, there is a very different social contract between, I think, Scotland and England. There is a very different social contract that's led here in Denmark or in Sweden to other countries. And I think we could all learn from the way different countries structure their willingness to share information, and the social contract underpins health for the benefit of everybody. There was a review which, if you haven't read, is really worth looking at. It's produced every year, and this year I think it came out in January from the Edelman organisation out of the United States. And they looked at who trusts who in the world at the moment. And it has an executive summary. You don't need to read 250 pages. But the summary I took away from that is increasingly people are trusting their peers, their friends, and their families for information, and not trusting institutions and organizations as they perhaps did one generation ago. And I think unless we appreciate how that social anthropology is changing, then organizations such as mine and organizations such as the World Health Organization will be behind the curve in how we are making information available. The Edelman review from January earlier of this year. And increasingly, as that information has become more bubbled in its nature, so that we all exist in our own internet bubble, we share information with others that are mostly like us and think like us. We get feeds from mostly newspapers that we probably more agree with than disagree with, and I won't say anything about my own political views, but since the referendum in the United Kingdom in June of last year, I've made it a point of reading the Daily Mail on a daily basis. It's painful. But I think it's important, because the truth is I would be the first to admit, and I, again, not say how I voted in the referendum, but I was in a bubble that didn't know people from an opposing view. And I think that increasing siloization of our societies is leading to increased fragmentation. And somehow we've got to work out how to break those down. So for the World Health Organization, what do I believe this means? Well, it's been a challenging few years for the WHO. Everyone knows that. But this is a new start. And in July of this year, a new Director General will take over. That will bring a new start to the organisation, and I think this is the moment to not look back and see the challenges that the organisation has had in the past. Many organisations have had challenges. This is the time to actually step up and say, what is our role for the future? And at a time when many countries are reverting into a more national agenda and a more isolated agenda, the need for organisations that reach beyond individual countries and have values which do stand for reducing inequality and for the most benefits to the maximum number of people, it is ever more important that those organisations are confident and bold. And humility is important, but don't be too humble. I don't think you as an organisation make the maximum voice to the positive things that you bring. In this area of data, for instance, the material transfer toolkit, just one example of something which I think you have led and which has brought real benefits. And you can stand things. I do believe that you've got to be the voice and the conscience of global health and make that statement, even if at times that will not be well received even by some of the member states. That is when I believe WHO has been at its boldest. And one of the great challenges of our time is how to use information and data and how to use it in the most equitable way. And this could be something which the WHO could really stand behind and get behind. And WHO Euro, in particular, could really push this agenda forward in a way that I'm not sure who else will do it if you don't. I think you do, as an organisation and as leaders of those organisations, you do sometimes have to step back and say, if we don't do this, who will? And who else has that voice? And it's a time, I think, for the WHO to reclaim that leadership role and be confident in itself. Yes, setting standards and normative values, but actually standing for something more than that, for standing for the values that go back to the start of the organisation, 70 years ago. For Wellcome, we are absolutely committed to data sharing. My predecessors led the reason why the human genome is now in the public domain, not solely in the private sector. We haven't moved away from that. We would like very much to work with you and with others who are committed to data sharing, to information flow, to making sure that that addresses those and there are no people left behind. And that doesn't just mean the academic sector. We're working with 13 pharmaceutical industries companies at the moment to make sure all of clinical data from their work is openly available to everybody else. Data sharing will be a major part of the WHO R&D blueprint, which I continue to chair. And we need as an organisation, and other funding organisations need to make sure that we don't put any barriers in place for academics and university sectors around the world to share information. The academic community is currently incentivised to not necessarily share in the ways that I think is the most helpful for public health and indeed for taking research forward. And things like Biobank in the UK, 500,000 people part of a cohort, the Kaduri cohort in China, 500,000 people, the 150,000 cohort in Mexico, which is looking particularly at metabolic diseases. The more that those could be seen and living the working together, the better. And I think that would be benefit to everybody, because in the end, data is important, quality of data is important, and the robustness of that data is important. And in this world, scale is hugely important. And so by bringing those together and using those as examples of how best to share information, I think something is something the Wellcome can really contribute to. So as WHO moves forward and takes on this new area, we will be very supportive of it and would very much like to work in partnership with you in how you achieve that. But I come back to those three things, which I think are fundamental, and I don't think we've sorted out yet, which is making the case for the benefits, making case that those who share information will share in the benefits of that information, that this is trusted. And in a world where horribly termed fake news is becoming increasingly a thing, there is an absolute need for some organisations to stand as being a trusted holder and user and making available of data. And there aren't so many organisations in the world that have that opportunity. And I think WHO has to be back with that at its centre. And finally, if all of that is done without a connection to society, then I don't think we will maximise the benefits of it. Science and research and the improvements in public health only thrive when they exist, and they exist with the society in which they operate in. And if we move away from a sense that research or the forward public health is somehow in an ivory tower, divorced from the society in which it operates, then I don't think we'll see the benefits of this information age that we are currently in. So thank you very much for the invitation. Look forward to questions from any place and to my speakers.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. We'll take questions and have the discussion at the end. But for now, I'd like to welcome Claudia to say a little bit more from the WHO perspective about information, qualitative, quantitative data, and so forth.
Thank you very much. And always a challenge to speak after Professor Farrar. I would not be able to hold your attention at all without any slides, so I will show you some slides. But there is also another reason for that, because we want to actually show what we count and also why we think we count. And thank you very much for saying that. I do believe that the WHO has a unique role in being the conscience of public health in the world. And we also look forward to a renewal where we can support that. First of all, I want to thank, though, Professor Bhattacharya for his vision of these seminars. I actually attended the very first ones in 2004 and 5 in Geneva when I was working there, and I thought, what an amazing thing to do. And since we have taken over those seminars here at Euro, I have been very, very proud to see how it has expanded and how it has also become so relevant at country level. And of course also thank the Wellcome Trust for their generous support of this initiative. Without them, they wouldn't actually exist. And I think just to see the breadth of people here from the different divisions and some other UN organizations actually proves us right. So let me say why we think WHO, an organization that counts, why we count, in many ways. We count, of course, because we believe that we need to present you with some numbers and some evidence, but I think it also counts that we count. And I just want to quickly show you what we count and then tell you why I think we should count something else and perhaps not count at all. So this is something that very much feeds into what Professor Farrar has told us. Now, just to quickly illustrate, this is the WTO European region. It is very, very big, nearly 1 billion people from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and of course, all these 53 member states. It is a large region, so it is a very varied region, and that makes this region very, very exciting, I believe. And of course, there's WTO's mission. And when you look at the 6 core functions of WHO, and I'm sorry, I probably should move around a bit so people can actually see the screen, you can see that there's 3 of them that deal directly with counting, with numbers, and with evidence. And so what our division does is very much at the core of WTO's function. That's our mandate. We're there to count, we're there to show you the numbers, but much more than that, we are meant there to show you what to do with the numbers and how we can help countries to implement policies based on such evidence. Now, when we actually look at what gets measured, we have a number of views, and I want to just explore very quickly with the next few slides why those views all have merit. Well, of course, what gets measured gets managed, what gets measured gets done. But there's a lot more to that. And when you look at little Einstein here, and I have to walk here to actually read it off, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Now, that's perhaps a bit cryptic, but I would like to illustrate in a moment why we believe that is true. Busy, of course, does not equal important, and measured doesn't mean mattered. There are many other things that matter, and you know that from your day-to-day lives. In fact, what I want to show you now in the next few minutes is why we as humans and our culture are so relevant to what doesn't get counted and why we need to actually make sure it counts. And of course, just because you can measure doesn't mean that you should measure it. That is something we have been doing for a very long time. I think we're measuring a lot of things that we probably shouldn't or don't need to measure. And that is something that we're also addressing. We're addressing it through an initiative that is Europe-wide. When we started with this a few years ago, we had 1 member state interested. It's the European Health Information Initiative, and you can see the 6 areas there. It goes all the way from measurement, what else, to communication and strategy. But what is important about this, it is an initiative that tries to coordinate what goes on in terms of measurement and data in the European region. Measurement is the first thing I want to focus on for obvious reasons, because we actually show you a lot of the measurements that we do. We receive data from countries and we have tools, and these tools are known to everybody, so I'm not showing you anything new, but this is very much at the core business. I want to also illustrate now why we're moving far beyond this core business. We have a new tool, you can explore stuff, that's all very nice, and we have the initiative that actually coordinates what is going on in health information in the European region. And this is not just a handful of people in this initiative, it is actually now 34 members, mostly member states, chaired by Russian Federation and the Netherlands, and other big institutions, and the Wellcome Trust is among them. So we have European and global players, they're all saying that, great, you want to measure, but please do this in a harmonized and coordinated way, and please measure what really counts. And that is where I'm going now. Because in the European region we have a policy that was adopted in 2012, and this policy is very broad. It's a real public health policy. It's kind of Health for All Plus. And this policy has, not surprisingly, targets and indicators. And because we feel that we need to be accountable for implementing this policy in Europe, and because member states feel they need to be accountable, they're counting. And we're counting with 19 core indicators, and we have some very interesting targets that we're counting for. Now, when you look at number 4, the target is to enhance the well-being of the population in Europe. That, you say, well, isn't that obvious? Well, it isn't actually, because when you start having to count this sort of thing, it gets quite complicated. But that is also where the qualitative work comes in. Because what we are basing ourselves on, of course, is the definition of health. And that says it's much more than just the absence of disease. You can all rehearse this by heart. But when it comes to well-being and actually really looking at this element of well-being and measuring it, we're not doing that at all, actually. Well, we're doing it a little bit now. But until very recently, all that we have done is measure death, disease, and disability. So how do we measure health and how do we measure well-being, or at least describe it? Because that we have done very, very well for 65 years, and there's nothing to knock that. We should be doing this, but we need to do a lot more than that. And this is something that in this region we have taken very, very seriously, and with the support of this regional director, this has really taken off. Now, let us just look at this target again. I'm not showing you the other targets to enhance well-being of the European population. There are some core indicators on the right-hand side that describe well-being. There's a subjective one, that is life satisfaction. And there are some objective ones. And you say, are they really well-being? Yeah, we think they are, because this was constructed with the support of not only an expert group, but many other agencies, including the OECD, including the European Commission. And we think that employment, income distribution, social support, education are very key elements that can be measured for well-being. And in fact, they're measured by many, many institutions. And not only that, they actually mirror very well what is going on in the SDGs. In fact, the whole of Health 2020 does. It was kind of ahead of its time, so to speak. Now let us look at life satisfaction, because we're measuring it and we're actually correlating it. And what does it mean? The indicator actually says, how satisfied are you with life at this current point in time? And then you rate it from 1 to 10. And people do that in many countries. And then you can see all sorts of things going on. And you can see also it does somewhat correlate with life expectancy. It doesn't correlate everywhere with life expectancy. And you can also see that some people report pretty high life satisfaction but have low life expectancy. And that is very interesting. It is culturally very interesting, but it's obvious that a lot is going on there that does not really have a health equivalent. And you really need to disentangle what life satisfaction really means. Now, when we correlate it with GDP, we also see correlations, and this correlation is actually very strong in the European region, which is interesting. But there is one region, Latin America, where this does not work. We have high levels of life satisfaction with relatively low GDP and vice versa. So this is an interesting area. So the correlations that we have with what we call objective well-being indicators like income, etc., GDP, doesn't work everywhere. And it doesn't work everywhere in the same way, and certainly not to the same strength. So again, it is something that we need to disentangle. When you then look at European countries, you see all sorts of interesting things going on. Now, you see on the top, that is Estonia, that is the Netherlands, very high levels of self-reported life satisfaction. Then you see Germany in blue, kind of going down just after unification. All sorts of speculations as to why that should be. And then I just want to point out one other country, and that is Greece. And Greece, you can see on the red line, which suddenly slumps when the financial crisis hit. And so there are some really strong correlates. There's correlate with income, there's correlate with GDP. So things are moving somewhere in the direction of, is this finance related? And is this really something that we can say that life satisfaction, well-being is very strongly determined by money? Does money make you happy? Well, it seems to indicate it there. Now, this is perhaps not legible, so I will only say one or two things about it. But life events have a huge impact on life satisfaction. You can see how the death of a spouse or divorce initially reduces life satisfaction, and it goes up again. Very interesting. Divorce seems to actually enhance later on well-being to a great level, life satisfaction a few years after the divorce. But it is really clear that life events have a massive impact on life satisfaction as you report it. But not only that. When you look at personal freedom, perception of personal freedom and life satisfaction, you see that in some countries, and when you look at the very top, you can see that these are the very westernized countries, life satisfaction and personal freedom have a strong correlation. They don't in other parts. And it's fascinating to see that in some areas where freedom in your life can rank fairly low, but life satisfaction still ranks high. You think that there must be something else that's explaining this. Maybe it's very, very complex and we can't get to it, but I think we at WHO thought we should try. Now, maybe these are regional variations. And when we look, for example, at Western Europe, people tend to score fairly high on life satisfaction. But when you then look at other parts of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, you see they score more in the middle than Western Europeans. Some people say, yeah, of course, it's because they're much richer. We have just established that may not be so relevant. But obviously something is going on. Now, when you look at regional variations, you can look also at countries. And here you see, for example, regional variations in life satisfaction. Now, this is the year 2012 to 16, long after unification, a lot of equality between East and West. And you think, gosh, Eastern Germany still rates much lower. It rates its life satisfaction as much lower. And people saying, maybe that is the after effect of reunification and still a low employment, etc. And I thought, well, let's look at that and see whether this really holds true. So when you look at the interpretation and you compare life satisfaction between East and West Germany, you see quite a difference over time. That difference persisted, and this difference is still there in the year 2014. However, you can adjust this. And if you adjust for socioeconomic factors and household income, unemployment, you see something interesting. It does narrow, but it's still there. Money does not make happy, clearly. Something else is going on. Is it regional? Is it cultural? Within a country, the families are spread all over Germany. What is the difference between the guys living in Hesse to the one living in Pomerania? But obviously something is happening. Now, when we look at other reports, and here the World Happiness Report gives some insights, we see that there are lots of different determinants of life satisfaction. And you can see this here. They range from family and schooling, like income and parenting, to adult situations. And all of this plays a part. And when you actually rank countries and look at them, the top 10 happiest all score high on income. Okay. They all score high on healthy life expectancy, but that may be an outcome, not an input. Having someone to count on in times of trouble, that is social support, generosity, and freedom and trust. Now, this is really interesting because these are the things that we as WHO need to explore further. Of course, there are no numbers for that, but that should not matter so much. And the report also says that happiness and life satisfaction are both social and personal, and 80% of the variance of happiness actually occurs within countries. We've just seen that with Germany. Then Niels decided, he had the brilliant idea, to look at the World Values Survey, because they really explore all sorts of variables in the area of life satisfaction and well-being. And they created this cultural map. Now, what you see here is how different cultures rate things differently. That is survival versus self-expression values, which self-expression very important in Northern Europe, against the values of traditional versus secular values. And when you look at how countries score themselves, you can see there are some bubbles, and you were mentioning bubbles earlier, Jeremy. I think these bubbles occur in the world. They're not just our personal bubbles. All sorts of cultures seem to somehow be cohesive in the way that they tend to rate certain things that actually include well-being, like survival, self-expression. All of these are actually elements of life satisfaction and well-being. So this is a very interesting thing, we thought, and we thought, well, maybe then we really need to explore culture much more. And that is exactly what we did. Because where you're coming from really matters. So where you actually come from culturally has all sorts of implications for your health, but also in the way that you express what you feel. So when we started this off, and this is all the work of Niels, I get to present it, he's doing all the work, we said we need an expert group that really looks at the cultural context of health and how it determines not only how we report and experience health, but also how we value it. And this is what this group is doing. This group is trying to be really concrete. It is looking at what does culture mean in the context of health? And it says, how does culture affect the way that we express and measure health and well-being? And this group is actually now quite advanced. It has a lot of partners, including the Wellcome Trust, of course, that's generously funding this work, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but also UNESCO and others. This is really a multidisciplinary and a multi-sectoral kind of panel. And they're actually producing very concrete outputs, like policy briefs, and they're now working on a toolkit for policymakers. What do I do with culture in my country, and how can I include it when we start and implement policy? Now, there are quite a few things that they have published, I said, but also they really do advocacy and try to explain to countries why this is important. In the last regional committee, an action plan was adopted to strengthen the use of evidence for policy making. And one of the things this action plan says is you need to really understand the role of culture, and you need to tell us, member states, how to best use this in our policy making. There are also capacity building events that we do, but in the coming years, we really are hoping in this region to have a very good grasp on what culture means for health, for its measurement, for well-being and its measurement. And that, of course, includes a lot of other work. We can no longer just count beans and numbers. We need completely different types of evidence. That is why we said in the last European Health Report we need actually new evidence for the 21st century. That includes qualitative work, narratives, anthropological records. Too long we have caused the world to think that reporting on health and well-being means counting death, disease and disability. 70 years after this, we have decided we will now do something else. But better late than never. And this is something that we believe in the European region we can champion, because we have so many cultures and we have so much variety and heterogeneity. I'm sure this is also true for other regions, and this is why we think actually this should really be global work. So, when we come from the old dogma, and this is my final slide, that says if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, or nothing gets done, we think that needs to change. And the truth is actually the really, really important stuff is perhaps not measurable, but it matters all the same. And of course, it needs to be reported. And that is what Niels and his people are doing. With that, I will stop. Be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for the overview. Just before we do take questions, we have last but certainly not least, Morten Jerven. You're more than welcome to take the podium or stay where you are. Morten is going to give us a historian perspective, a bird's eye perspective on this question of a world that counts. Over to you.
Thank you. Is my
Yeah,
slides
you
on?
just click on. I might have to forward a few slides.
Right.
There we go.
There we go. A little bit back. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. So a historian's perspective, or at least a slightly different perspective, and I will also try to provide a slightly provocative perspective, but also building on exactly where Claudia left off on what we can measure and what we can't measure. Yeah, and I'm taking starting point in a world that counts, and expert report ordered by the UN Secretary General, providing a technical report about how the world should be reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we just heard also in Claudia's talk many clever wordplays using the word count, because it's so nice with count, because it means two things, matter and counting. And but I would think that maybe it's clever, but it's also kind of misleading. And I will also say that when it comes to that mission statement here, never again should it be possible to say we didn't know. No one should be invisible. This is the world we want, a world that counts. I fundamentally disagree with this. So I think that it should always be possible to say we didn't know. In fact, maybe one of my missions in life is to try to create space for saying we don't know. And I think sometimes pretending that you know something that you don't is one of the biggest dangers we have.
I think it's a very, knowing that not everything that counts can be counted, it would be exactly the world I don't want to live in is the one that counts, yeah? Because then we are by design cutting out lots and lots of important stuff, yeah? And also it is an illusion that through counting you can make everything visible. So if we go around in UN organizations thinking that, oh, people are still invisible or aspects are still invisible, and that's only because we don't count enough, we're on the wrong path. Yeah, and the rest of the talk is just going to make that point. Yeah, that's the. But first one, I'm a bit. So first, clarify some. I'm using Venn diagrams. If you don't understand how they work, then do stop me. The first type of critique I would like to make of the data revolution in development is that the word data and statistics have been conflated. We have managed to minimize what is, data is what is given, information broadly seen. And I admire the steps you're taking in that, in trying to broaden, again, the definition of data. The World That Counts report is actually a report on how to make statistics work for monitoring sustainable development goals. But they never ever use the word statistics. They only talk about data. I think that's because a data revolution sounds sexy and cool. Statistics revolution sounds scary and boring, or a mix of the two. So it's not that strange. But it's actually, as a social scientist, it's a very worrying type of way, saying that, okay, we're only, from now on, only going to use that part of data that can be digitized or being put in numbers. So that's part of the data revolution is actually actively sorting out the information that can be digitized, but leaving other types of information behind. And that's a challenge that UN and WHO should be meeting head on. And also, as any clever presenter, you always try to bring some Albert Einstein into the air to hope it rubs off on the presenter. And so it's a tried and tested category. And I'm doing my best here. But saying that, if we are in a world that, saying that only stuffs that count is the stuff that we're going to rely on, then we are, of course, in using the Venn diagrams, there's a lot of stuff you can count that doesn't matter at all, and most of the stuff that really matters cannot be counted. So that's why it's very easy to do a anti-poverty agenda that is targeting dollars and cents, but really hard to do one that deals with empowerment. Yet we know that poverty is all about empowerment and very little to do with dollars and cents, and therefore we are then actively pursuing the wrong policy if we're only listening to the stuff that's easy to count. Also, I'm reminded of the saying that, there is a naive trust that somehow the only thing we need to do is to get better numbers, then we'll do the right thing. The counterfactual would be that Uganda wouldn't have a poverty problem if they had better poverty statistics. We know there are other types of, that's not the hindering factor here, as long as we get exactly the millions counted correctly. Politicians tend to use statistics as lampposts, that is as drunk men use lampposts, and that is then for support, not illumination. And reminding yourself about that, sticking with the theme of drunk men and lampposts, then there is also a drunk man on his knees under a lamppost looking for something, and another drunk man comes over and says, "What are you looking for?" "My keys. Did you lose them here?" "No, but here is where the light is shining." Yeah. And so therefore, if we do set up an agenda, the world that counts is, drunk man in lampposts. And that's not the world I want. Well, sometimes, but not really. I think there are some stuff we're missing in our thinking about data and development. Supplies, we all talk about data sharing and all that stuff, but there's a lot of work to be done on data production. We drew up a massive long list of 230-something indicators and targets and so forth, the Sustainable Development Goals, without really putting a thought into who's going to produce this data, who's going to pay for this data, and if there is problems about supply, if data is expensive, which it is, just like a kind of a rule of thumb, if we think that doing a population census in the US costs about $35 per person counted, then you start do the numbers about how much it would cost just to count the whole world, yeah, of 8 billion or whatever, how many people we have. The Nigerian population census and so forth is proving too costly, and that's maybe one of the stumbling blocks of having to do one. So statistics do have a cost, and if they do, then we have to worry about their supply and demand. And if there are mismatches there, you get deteriorating quality of supply, yeah? Or people just make stuff up. And I'm going to show you how that happens shortly. So if quality of statistics, if supply of statistics is expensive, then there is we need to worry about quality of statistics. If numbers are very soft or missing or things are difficult to count, then incentives matter. Then people will be starting to give you the numbers that you demand. And finally, I think there is a mismatch about this kind of naive technocratic agenda that we just need the more numbers. We need to also think about how does just numbering and counting change the political behavior. Filling the data gaps, I did one of the, if you do cost, how much it would cost just to monitor the SDGs, my back of the envelope estimate is that you would use the whole, at least one global aid budget during that period on measurement alone. So that leaves you somewhere around almost as much as 10% or higher estimates of 15% used on statistics. So not vaccinations, not enrollments and so forth. And there is no state out there in the world that uses 10 to 15% on their statistical office. The budget goes to all other kinds of things. Norwegian statistics gets like 0.01% of the Norwegian budget. Granted, it's a big one. Granted, we're only 4 million people, but why would we devise a global agenda of using 10 to 15% of the money on statistics? The short answer is that we won't. The money won't be spent, so we will have the database, the SDG database, just like the MDG database, will have much more gaps than observations in them. And we'll be pretending to count stuff, but we won't be able to do it. And we ask statisticians to fill the gaps, yeah, using the gap-filling method, which is filling the gaps with other kinds of stuff. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. We have ignored the fact that one of the most powerful lessons of the MDG report, we don't know whether the MDGs actually solved China's poverty problem or not. I'm going to lean towards not, that it was probably China who solved that. But I think that one of the things we know for sure is the MDG process has a powerful informational impact. Yeah? And also, and importantly, in low-income countries, it's been observed that the MDG process did maybe not have a positive impact on statistical production there. Instead, many of the statistical offices in that region, in many low-income regions, became, in effect, data collection agencies for hire. So that institutes are collecting data in order to global monitoring, but with the relevant data for national policy making suffers. So how big is this kind of knowledge gaps? I said that the money is not available to monitor all these goals. I'm going to turn to something that is pretty easy to measure first, and that's dollars and cents, GDP, gross domestic product. So how much do we know about income, which was stressed as being important? And then I'm going to end up with measuring something that is really difficult. It could have been life satisfaction, but I'm going to do governance, yeah, or democracy, or how we all know that governance is very important for development or how things are being ruled, getting things done and so forth. But how do we measure it? If we think it's the most important thing, then we should measure it, and how do we measure it? But first, let's start about GDP. It appeared on the 5th of November 2010, it appeared that some of the GDP numbers are very soft indeed. In 2010, on the 4th of November, GDP in Ghana was about 25 billion cedi. On the 5th of November, it was 45 billion cedi. So on the 4th of November, Ghana was a poor country. On the 5th of November, it was a low-income country. On the 4th of November, Ghana was eligible for concessional lending from the World Bank. On the 5th of November, it was a graduate and entered capital markets. GDP per capita increased about 60% that evening. And of course, that raised, it's good news, but it does raise some kind of, at least red faces about those people who wrote reports about what's required to take Ghana into middle income status, when it turned out it was just solved down at the statistical office. It turns out that this was not an isolated case. On a Sunday afternoon in April 2014, the director of statistics in Nigeria, Yemi Kale, stepped to the podium on Hilton Hotel in Abuja. And by the time he was done with his statement, Nigerian GDP had increased 89%. On that Sunday afternoon, Nigeria outjumped South Africa as the biggest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Do not be alarmed, South Africans. South Africa has now released new GDP numbers, and they're now back up on top. I guesstimated in 2012, having read about the Ghana revision, that I thought about 40 Malawis was at that point unaccounted for inside of Nigeria. It turned out it was 58. Yeah, it's not. I mean, this is not that strange. There is about GD baselines, updating all that economic information. If you know a little bit about national accounting, you would know this happens all the time. The point being that some of these things we think are being very solid, firm benchmarks are very soft and moving targets indeed. Yeah, and when you do go to the World Bank or WHO, you can see data points every year, 1960 to 2010. But this is a very floating, soft type of thing. What we tend to think are hard facts are really soft guesses. And if you start thinking about that, we need to do this work seriously. And sometimes, I think, even in the policy world, but certainly also in the research world, and definitely among journalists, there's this kind of idea that you wouldn't touch a number from the Sudanese statistical office, but as long as it's walked through the door and out again of the World Bank or the IMF, it's fine. But of course, they forget that some of these numbers where do they come from? They come from the statistical offices. Here's Ghana Statistical Service, where I did my research. I was not surprised when Ghana revised their GDP upwards. I had conversations with Mr. Duncan here at the head office about the upcoming GDP revision. Here's the informal sector here in front, a peanut saleswoman. And I asked Duncan whether she was counted in the new estimates, and he said, it's just peanuts. It turns out it does make a difference when you do add them up. Here is the Nigerian Living Standard Surveys in the bags in Abuja Statistical Office in 2011. They were busy entering them where I was there. It still took another 5 years before the data was ready. A part of that was because a Finnish consultant slipped on an airport, I think in Doha or it was in Doha, in Dubai. He slipped on I like to say it's a banana peel, but it probably wasn't. But let's, for sake of the story, it was a banana peel. Slipped, twisted his ankle, and then Nigerian GDP revision was delayed 13 months. Yeah. So the sub-Saharan African GDP was 20% too low for more than a year because a Finnish person slipped on an airport. And that tells a little bit about the inner workings of knowing that if you want to know about the quality of these estimates, you need to know who made the observation, under what condition was the observation made, and is there any reason to think that the observation might be biased. It's very basic journalist kind of stuff, historian stuff even. But if we tend to forget this and think that we can just take this data from the thin air. And that's what my book, 2013 book, was about, talking about the statistical offices in sub-Saharan Africa. My more later book was more about how the use of these kind of statistics together with correlates and econometric models then turn into another level of a knowledge structure that can also be quite misleading. Because not all data are, of course, made at the statistical office themselves and part of the administrative structures. There is also survey data, so which the WHO leans itself on. Quite often also the most famous one is probably the poverty data, the dollar a day, or now it's dollar 1.802 cents. When the UN Secretary General announced in 2015 that we met MDG 1, halving world poverty, it was a bold statement, to say the least, but partly because it was a very clear indication of the PR department being way ahead of the knowledge department at the United Nations, because in 2015, the 2015 data were not ready yet. I mean, we are still 2019, we might see what the actual poverty levels were in 2015, so you definitely called it a little bit early. You also forgot to tell us that from the 1990s, the baseline from which we were measuring, we only have poverty data from 1/4 of the countries, and even today we only have satisfactory data from about half. Yeah, and even so, there are problems with this type of data. And I think you can make the same point, for instance, about the global disease burden data as well, relying on survey data, but from a very mixed bag of a type of sample. So if you talk about is poverty going up or down in Africa since 1990? Well, then it's only 27 out of 48 countries that have at least 2 surveys. Yeah, and as you famously know, you need 2 points to draw a line saying whether it goes up and down. So for 21 of them, we are just guessing, or even worse, if you're really poor, you're so poor that you have to borrow poverty data from other countries. And that's indeed what econometrician makes countries do sometimes. I mean, Congo does not actually go out there and say, can I please borrow some poverty data? But economists need to have the global data and so forth like that. So here, for instance, you have a graph showing the poverty data, poverty line in Congo, DRC, which is based on exactly 0 data points. Yeah? So in this case, you just calculated the elasticities between poverty and growth in other countries for which we have data, so Ghana and Senegal and Tanzania and so forth, and use those average parameters to calculate poverty back in there. I think that if I was invited to Denmark to give a talk, if I would ever be invited, that's very unlikely, I guess, but if I was invited and I was going to talk about poverty in Denmark, 1970 to 2010, and if I entered the room and said I didn't find any Danish poverty data, so I'm going to do an average of Spain and Germany instead, I think I would have been thrown out of the room. But what we have to wonder about is, why do we let this pass for very poor countries? Why is it that the distance between the observed and the observer has allowed to grow that big? So that should make the point that some of the numbers and the data we're using is much softer and weaker than we would like to think they are. So we know much less than we would like to think about poor people in poor countries. And so what happens then to the data is, I'm mindful of keeping to the time as well, so I won't go into all of these details, but what we see from examples in vaccination data on Tanzania, school enrollment in Kenya, fertilizer in Malawi, all of these are supported by publications you can look up as well, is this, that we don't get evidence-based policy, but we get the opposite, we get the policy-based evidence. So if you do dangle really clearly carrots in front of saying, in Kenya, they got $1 per student put through primary school, and lo and behold, Kenya's primary enrollment rates, as reported by administrative statistics, went up. But if you measure it by demographic health surveys, it turns out it's flat. And if you compare it before and after effect, then you find out that the only thing that really happened through this program is that now the Kenyan government does not know any longer how many people go to school. But whether it had an effect on primary enrollment, we don't know. So data is very, very weak. We have to be very careful to put incentives towards it, because you will not distort, you will not change the world, you'll change the world that counts. I mean, so the statistical one. Here's a paper I did with Andrew Kerner and Alison Beatty, shows, for instance, the IDA threshold. So the most important, GDP is important for poor countries because it sets, now it's $1,200, which then tells you that you get a discount on your loan or not. Yeah. And through time, you can find out that countries are clustering disproportionately, so just under that line. So you would expect it to be a normal distribution, but not that unexpectedly, countries are just reporting in GDP data so that they're just exactly $50 poor enough. And then if they do end up on the wrong side of that line, they will negotiate fiercely in order to get on the right side again. So it's not that surprising, but just to make the empirical point. I'm going to talk about knowledge and governance by numbers in the end. I'll skip these 2 parts to make sure I don't use all the time, and rather than talk about 2 ways of measuring governance. Yeah, so the knowledge and governance effects of measuring governance. So something that's really hard. I've been so far talking about stuff that should be easy to measure. Let's do something difficult. Governance. So governance, we know what it is, democracy, good behavior and all that stuff. The problem is that it doesn't exist, so it's very hard to measure. I mean, there's no theory of it. It's not like you can read a book on governance or democracy and then figure, aha, now I know how to measure it. You can read a book by Fisher, for instance, on the theory of prices, and then you can afterwards go to your supermarket and measure inflation, because it's that straightforward. It hangs together with theory. And so measuring inflation you can do, we all know what democracy or good rule looks like. But it's a little bit like measuring the weather. If you start putting up different kind of things like elections, strength of the executive, independence of the judicial, freedom to start a party, and all that stuff, you start weighting it, it would be a little bit like creating a weather index, where we all know what the weather is, right? It's rainfall, there is some temperature in it, there's some wind, but you wouldn't, well, you shouldn't, but you can do it, but I don't think you will be very successful in launching a weather index in which you would then try to like aggregate all of them so that suddenly you can wake up one morning and say, oh, the weather is 3.2. And say, well, okay, does that mean it's going to rain? Or no, they just said 3.2. And that's very much the same thing if you use the governance indicators to wonder what should you do about political reform in Egypt. And you get the freedom of house, where it says 22. And so the number itself just allows you to rank, but you're not able to go and find out anything and so forth. And a lot of these global aggregates are exactly like that. You're able to go up. You get that infrastructure. You can do the little dance, you know, in the quadrants and so forth. But you can't go back down and figure out what's going on. So that kind of global aggregation is an interesting phenomenon. So it means that you can make something up, or you can measure by as if. So you can measure how many people died or so forth like that, and then do something. So here's two ways so all measures of governance will be imperfect. So we just have to think through in which way and what kind of behavior are they going to induce. So one way you could do it is to measure governance as the World Bank does it, through ease of doing business index, widely hailed as the only efficient thing that the World Bank ever did, was to launch this type of index. It really has had a massive influence. If you fly into poor countries, you probably see the ranking advertised in the airline magazine and all that stuff. It's high visibility stuff. In Rwanda and in Georgia, there's own people who are employed at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs just reading the Ease of Doing Business Index and figuring out which law they can change to get the most impact on the ranking. So this is what the kind of gaming effect, that means that they know they're being measured and therefore they're changing the behavior, not to be better governed, but to be ranked better. And that is always going to be a friction between the two. I am a professor at the university. I prefer my students to become good historians, not aiming to get a good grade in history. And luckily, I design the syllabus and the evaluation, so those things are exactly the same. But in many aspects of life, we know there are very big differences between, for instance, in the ease of doing business, which is overrepresenting transnational companies and so forth like that. It tells you nothing about how it is to be a smallholder farmer. It is measuring written law, not practiced law, and so forth like that. So you're actually inducing perverse gaming behavior. Or you can do it like the Transparency International Corporation Index. The Millennium Challenge Corporation put as one of their 3 indicators to say whether they're going to disperse more funds to Liberia or not. One of the indicators was governance. And then, of course, that has to be measured. So Liberia should be better governed, and then they will get more money. And then they put in the contract that they should use the data from the Transparency International, which is hugely frustrating to Liberia, because you know how Transparency International measure corruption? They call people and say, how corrupt do you think the country is? So basically, Liberia is not have now to do anything with corruption. That's secondary. They have to do something about prejudices about corruption in their country. So you have to somehow change people to answer that question differently, which is not the same thing. And you also think that, you know, it's a real puzzle. If you are running the if you are in the president's office in Liberia right now, does this mean I'm being measured by the Transparency International? Does that mean that I should pursue more corruption cases or less? I would lean towards less, because I want less corruption cases in the media. So therefore, again, you have a perverse effect of this. And these are both imperfect ways. Governance matters, then therefore the question is whether we should measure it itself. So there are some pitfalls. Always when you measure things and use the indicators for stuff, it then very often becomes the phenomena itself, so that you try to be higher ranked rather than to be doing better on governance. And so to conclude, and I really should conclude, shouldn't I, Niels?
Yes.
Yes? I think that maybe some of us, we have to agree with what Claudia says, I think that we need to really revisit the measure what we treasure type of dogma, because there is really might be true that precisely those things that we do treasure, we should not measure. And there's many aspects in life that the decisions you do not rely on numbers are the important ones. And those are the costly ones. That's when you have to sift through knowledge. That's when you have to really do the job. To make a decision, say 3 is smaller than 4, that's no business. But to actually make a decision, you actually have to do the hard job. And that's what I will conclude at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morten. So as is always, if those of you still have a little bit of time, I'd encourage you to stick around. We do want to have a discussion, get a discussion going. As is always the case with these types of seminars, they are very, very interesting, and there's a lot of information to get through. But we do have another 10 or 15 minutes. I think Claudia might have to leave a bit earlier, but we can try to extend it beyond that as well if people still have time. We have had some questions online. Before I go and ask a few of those, I want to encourage you as well to participate and to think of your questions. Of course, we want to take some from the floor as well as ask some of the questions online. But if I can take the chair's prerogative and just kind of kick us off with one broad philosophical question, because we've heard a lot of we've heard a lot of caveats about the world that counts, question mark, and that question mark is very important. But I'd like to ask the panel if you have any ideas about how can we make information, and perhaps with a particular focus on health information or information for health, how can we make it stronger? How can we perhaps break out of this siloed mindset that information really is just numbers that count? What else can we think about when it comes to information generally, if you want to keep it at the general level, but perhaps health information specifically? And perhaps Jeremy, I can ask you to kick us off, and just remind you that in case your microphone isn't on, to switch it on, please.
So it was great listening to those talks, but I think between us, somehow, we've got to move beyond the critique, which is crucial, to actually finding some solutions.
Yeah.
And I think I come from a medical and biomedical and public health background. Others come from a different background. And if we continue, particularly through the training of next generations, to continue to go down the silo of separating the perspective of counting, biomedical, social science, whatever it is, then we will always exist in these silos, and each will sort of end up throwing rocks at each other. But in the end, unless there is a sort of common acceptance of what it is that we're trying to get to, and whether we're going to measure that or not, or how are we going to calibrate it, I'm not sure we're going to make progress. And there's no doubt that if you incentivize certain data gathering, you will get the answers that drive that. If my own experience of, if you want, you just stop doing malaria smears if you want malaria incidence in your country to go down. There are multiple ways of demonstrating that malaria is dropping, and one of them is to never look for it. And this is gamed everywhere. What I don't think we've come away with yet, and is quite the solution to that, because doing nothing is not the solution.
Claudia, do you want to say a few things about the Euro solution?
Well, I don't have a solution, but I think there are ways that we can move in that direction. And just to pick up where Jeremy stopped is, I think what we're doing is we're looking exactly for what Morten was saying. We measure what we treasure instead of going to the people, and that includes the policymakers, that includes many other stakeholders, civil society, and etc., and say to them, what is actually your policy question? That is what the Evidence-Informed Policy Network does, and it's doing it since 2012 in this region. They go to countries and bring together a set of multidisciplinary stakeholders and say, right, so what is the policy question, rather than saying, well, here's the evidence, do something with it. In other words, you're actually asking what kind of evidence is useful to you. Is there anything that we can measure that you can use to answer that question? If not, how can we get it? Or what other things matter to you in terms of information that you need to implement such a policy? And I think that is the way to go. Unfortunately, I think programs like this, and they're strong in this region, but not so in other regions, they are kind of orphaned, and they're an afterthought, while they should be at the very basis of why we collect information, may that be qualitative or quantitative. And I think that kind of thing, this sort of reversal, is somewhere we need to go. I'm not knocking the great efforts of health information, that's my core business, and certainly not the burden of disease. But that is basically saying, here's your evidence, now act. Instead, we should say, what is your question? What kind of evidence do you need? What is useful evidence and what isn't? And what kind of arena can we get it from? And I think unless we make that our routine, I don't think we will actually get there.
Very interesting. And Morten, from your perspective, as somebody who works within the social sciences, I mean, I know historians and philosophers and people from the humanities and social sciences see their role as being the people, as you described them, who create space and who ask critical questions. But is there also a role for the historian to contribute towards this data gathering exercise, towards this information movement?
Yeah, obviously, I think one obvious policy implication for this is that we need to think about the informational feedback loop as part of the policy intervention. So it has to be not as an afterthought of saying, like, here's the policy and here's the evidence, but actually have it think about it in the same way. So that means decentralization, knowledge production would be an important part of this, because if the ruler or the state or the institution themselves depend on the quality of the information, then themselves they cannot distort it. So, but if there is a long distance between the ones who, so if we build up, the very classic mistake would be to have a defunded statistical office and then having lots of processing power and a lot of money bags at the very top, and then the people who are out there are just trying to get the money back, but they're not doing stuff. So I think it's about incentive, and so thinking about. When you do an intervention, so like and with the measurement and evidence agendas, you have to think through, okay, so how is this going to affect production of knowledge? Not only vaccinations, but also how are we getting better or worse vaccination knowledge in the next round here? I think that's some of the keys.
I'm happy to take a few questions from the floor. We have some roving mics on the side. Does anybody have any questions to any of the speakers in particular? Don't be shy. Or perhaps more generically to the panel. I'll give you a second. Perhaps have a think. We can also go to the web and see what we have there. We have one question that was voted up quite highly, which is from Sude, who's a WHO colleague, and she talks to your question about trust, Jeremy. About trust that's related to trust and political trust. And she asked the question, how about trust in high quality research data when more and more false data are being published in high impact factor journals? So the kind of erosion of trust that perhaps journals can also be implicit in, because they are interested in corroborative data as opposed to data that disproves theories or ideas.
Yeah, so I mean on that, I think we do need to what's the words used?
Trust.
False data. I mean, there's false data is one thing, reproducible data is another, and the scientific approach, whatever science you're talking about, the scientific approach that is an evolutionary process that builds on prior data, much of which may or may not be true, but which over time improves. So I think you've got to distinguish between false data made up, non-reproducible data to understand why or why not it's reproducible, and then accept that much data that you generate in any of the sciences across the biomedical, social, etc., may well be true at the point it's done, but which will evolve over time. And I don't know the evidence to suggest that is increasing and getting worse within journals. I'll just come back though to something Claudia just said, because I think we do need though to distinguish. You said that we put the evidence out there and then we ask what the policy question is, and it should go the other way around. But actually, a lot of the stuff that is asked for in terms of data has come from a question that said, we want to know what to do in this circumstance. Let's take malaria. Is it going up or down? And somebody to try and provide the evidence on which to make policy decisions. Now, whether policymakers then use that evidence, well or badly, that's another issue and something we have to understand. But if you look at the wealth of data that's out there, I think a lot of it has actually come from somebody asking, we want to do something, but we want to know how to calibrate it.
Yeah, but often very late. And then you have years of lag between the question and the actual policy implementation. And this is something that frustrates a lot of people. And if you have a rapid response, that is great. But very frequently the world has moved on by the time you get the answer to the question raised. Not in all areas, and I think infectious disease is actually different. But in terms of non-communicable diseases, etc., there are really different arenas that you're thinking about. And very often the question may be obsolete by the time that you have the evidence. I'm not saying obsolete, but it is outdated, or it is perhaps no longer relevant to the policymaker who has asked the question as a new government is in place. And that is something that we frequently see. We see such a high turnover of policymakers and policy questions that actually I think you need a very, very good rapid mechanism to supply that. That is very rare and in some instances actually not possible.
I think that also links up with that, which level, and that some of the data, like the global disease burden or the poverty data, you're able to figure out exactly 119.1 million people are living in poverty. But if you go down, you will not find how many poor people are in Congo because they were not surveyed. So we know it on the global level. We don't know.
It's an estimate. Yeah.
But when then it's also the same thing with the timeliness of the data as well. So getting the validity, getting exactly the right baseline takes very long time.
Yeah.
So that from the minute you say, I want to know how many people seen a doctor last week in Kenya, if you do that the traditional survey method, you'll find out 3 years later. And that's a bit too late for the sitting health minister. But it works for the global reporting mechanism, but not for the local policy. So again,
different types of information needed.
Yeah.
If I can just come in on that, I know, Claudia, you have to leave in a second.
Leave, yeah.
But there is a question here which is germane to what you were saying about marginalized people, essentially. And it's directed at Jeremy, but perhaps, again, we can ask the kind of the panel as a whole. How do we ensure that vulnerable and marginalized don't get further marginalized and victimized in the race of sharing data and information, but also gathering data and information? I don't know, Claudia, if you want to, if you have some thoughts on that just before you leave.
That is a very good question. It's actually a very complex question. It is actually, this inverse law is true. You have the people with the most need who have the least healthcare and have the least information about them. Actually, Michael Marmot said once that the inequalities in health information are so great that you cannot tackle health inequalities unless you first tackle the inequalities in health information. So where we need to know the most, we know the least. That is really only tackleable, I think, at a political level. But what that means is we are now asking countries to do something that is really near impossible. When you look at the SDGs, UNECE recently looked into this and said that even the very best countries with the very best information systems will only be able to report on 50% of the indicators. 50%, the very best. You're talking Norway, Sweden, Germany, the UK. And 76 out of the 169 targets could potentially be serviced, and that's it. And for the rest of the world, well, let's not speculate. But I think this is something where investment, and you talked about that, Morten, into the area of collecting, first of all, the information you need, the information you want, and then actually report it fast is key. I think the very first thing we need to do is really decide what is the information we really need. I don't think we have ever really done that. And if that is decided, I think then we can also say, where do we get it from to ensure that we survey everyone who counts, and that is everybody. I really don't think we're even close to that. And I believe it needs a completely new vision of information gathering, analysis, interpretation, and use at the highest levels of government and also at the highest level of UN international organizations.
Thank you, Claudia. I know you have to,
I have to catch an airplane.
Thank you so much for
thank
joining
you,
us.
and apologies, and thank you.
We may have, if people still have a few minutes time, I'm happy to take a couple more questions from the floor for Jeremy or Morten. If there are any, yes, please. Could we have a mic to the gentleman in the peach sweater?
Thank you.
Hi. So this potentially goes towards the information gathering aspect. Some of you may be aware of, in the private sector, of the migration towards information new information architecture, so distributed ledgers, and also enterprise data architecture that allows AI and machine learning to look at specific information within big data lakes. And my question is, to what extent can the public sector benefit from some of these private sector initiatives, and what may already be happening in that way?
So the big data revolution. I don't know, Morten, if do you think it's going to solve our problems?
Well, that's what we hope. But I think that's also one of the things that makes it hard to sit and predict that in Copenhagen or Geneva or for the World Accounts report as well. There's a lot of there needs to be some kind of data sharing or some kind of data, big data that needs to be used in this process, but exactly what kind of demands public institutions can put on private institutions in terms of sharing, what kind of data can be done, how to sort out different kinds of incentives, because it's not bad. It's very good to work with commercial operators because you know why they're in business. They're in business to do business, but then so you have to think through that aspect of it to do it. And a lot of the big data exhaust comes from commercial activities. So therefore, how to do that is still unknown. But you do notice that the term data revolution as well pinned a lot of hope on what will be coming there. But I think that still kind of searching for the right kind of things. There's a lot of interesting ideas out there, but exactly what's going to work and what's not going to work. I also wanted to say just briefly on the data on the vulnerable and marginalized as well. A very long history, and that brings to big data operator as well, is who does the counting. In a very long historical perspective, it's true that data counting is not always been benevolent motives. On average, it's true that if a state wants to count you, it's to kill you or tax you. And so if you take a long view of the 20th century and you do like random ruler of a country in the world of 195, so would you have liked to get all your information to that ruler? Then your average answer should be no, because that person would have done something bad with it, not something good with it. So there is also, it's not about, so we need to think through the politics of the actors and the interactions of these in this, and not only like get the information and get that wheel turning, as Jeremy as well talked about. It's not that straightforward.
But I think, and I think everyone's briefly mentioned this. I think there's a growing divide between something we're calling the private sector and something we're calling the public sector. And I'm not convinced that sufficient elements of the public sector around the world have really quite engaged sufficiently yet with the possibilities, albeit that there will be negative consequences as well. But the possibilities that what you're talking about couldn't open up new opportunities. And accessing, getting information to marginalized communities, the barrier to entry for that has undoubtedly got lower. The question is, how does society use it in the best way possible? And I think there has to be we have to close the gap between where the so-called public and private sectors are gathering. And I think many are still 10 or 20 or 30 years behind where they could be in terms of driving the agenda, in terms of information.
I can see that people are probably itching to get back to their desks, so we will draw this seminar to a close. I do wonder if there's anybody has a final burning question that they want to get off their soul, or forever rest in peace. In which case, I'd like to finish off. Sanjay, do you have a final question?
Yeah, I mean, I was just wondering
if we can just get you a microphone so that you're on the air.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was wondering here about multilingualism, because often when I speak to colleagues who are involved in systematic reviews, the evidence base seems to be largely in English. And yet, in complex societies and continents and countries, information is available in a variety of languages. So I just wonder if the basis for collecting and analyzing raw data, if systematic reviews are to be treated as a way of collecting raw data, could benefit from multilingualism. And if that sort of widens the evidence base, which is also detached from government collection, largely, I mean, some of the papers are actually published by government officials as well. So,
yeah. No, I think it's a lot of the variation which Claudia showed on life satisfaction might very well be exactly that. It might be different ways of that question just sounds different in different languages. I mean, it's very powerful evidence of that about doing a labor force survey in Tanzania, where sometimes they ask una barua, so do you have a profession? Other times they say unafanya kazi, do you work? And if you say una barua, then they would say 98% would say no, I don't. I'm in the informal sector, so I'm unemployed. But if you say unafanya kazi, are you working? Of course, everyone works, otherwise they would die. So then you have so it's not possible to do it. So that means that some of the across that kind of translation we do. Numbering is translation, and a lot of things are lost in translation, as we know. But so that is a challenge, and I think ways in which you can think as well. Also on the big data opportunity as well. I think one of the things that closing that gap, I think, which is real. It also means that we cannot, in public sector or whatever you call it, sit around waiting for the private sector to give you the right app one day. But it actually means that there is technology work to be done, in innovation and invention. Not only sit around and hope that M-Pesa is going to figure out how to survey poverty as well. So then the World Bank doesn't have to do that. That's not how it's going to work.
Thank you. And on that note, perhaps a very small shout out with all the mention of big data to also think, and I think the last question there addresses that. I don't think we have time to get into it, but this idea of small data, the idea that of using narrative information, for instance, anthropological field work, the kind of work that is more close and personal, particularly when you're trying to get at questions around well-being. How can that contribute towards our understanding of health and health information? But with that, I'd like to bring the seminar to a close. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Jeremy, Claudia, and of course Morten, for their fantastic contributions. I also want to thank the Global Health Histories Center, University of York, for their continued support and obviously their pioneering work that they're doing with the Global Health History Seminars. It's always a pleasure to work with you, Sanjoy, and your team, and the Wellcome Trust for helping to support it. Thank you so much for coming. The next seminar is on the 21st of September. We hope to see you there again. Have a great afternoon.